Welcome to the debate. Today we're tackling a really fundamental question about modern democracy, the systemic influence of private wealth and corporate power in shaping political outcomes. And we're going to contrast the environments in the United States and Australia. Our core question is this: is Australia's subtle, kind of legalized opacity, what the source material calls state capture, is that fundamentally more insidious, more resistant to reform than the, let's say, explicit oligarchic model that's fueled by mass dark money spending in the US? Now, I'll be arguing that Australia's, well, genius for policy management and institutional capture, often operating under a veil of technical legality, makes its system uniquely effective and frankly very hard to dismantle.
And I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle. While Australia clearly has some, severe problems with hidden financing and these access schemes, I'd maintain that the USA's political financing regime is actually the greater threat. Its anti-democratic nature isn't subtle at all, it's structural. By basically enshrining unlimited political spending as protected speech, thanks to key Supreme Court rulings, the U.S. has fundamentally dismantled the principles of democratic equality. It's instituted a clear, self-perpetuating oligarchy.
Okay, let's break down the Australian mechanism first, because I think it's often misunderstood as just a set of, donation loopholes. The primary threat here, as defined in our source material, is state capture. That means the sustained effort by private actors to shape policies really for their own narrow financial interests, using complex and often perfectly legal channels. It's quite sophisticated influence. It really goes beyond just winning elections. It's about managing the entire political playing field. Essentially making sure both major parties, that's the Labour Party, ALP, and the Coalition, LNP, are sufficiently, let's say, beholden to key industry interests. So that, regardless of who's actually in government, the overall policy direction stays favorable to those industries. And this whole strategy thrives on opacity, which crucially is enshrined in law. Just consider the major party fundraising forums like the Federal Labor Business Forum. These outfits sell privileged access. We're talking dinners with senior decision makers, private policy briefings for substantial fees, sometimes up to, $110,000? And here's the key bit. These payments are often classified as membership fees or other receipts, not as direct donations. That classification lets them completely bypass public accountability and scrutiny, neatly sidestepping what Australians often call the pub test, the public expectation of basic transparency.
Okay. That system of pay-to-play access is certainly, appalling. But if we're comparing the severity of the damage, we really have to look at the foundation of the U.S. system. The U.S. model's anti-democratic nature isn't subtle, it's structural. And it's been explicitly codified by judicial fiat, essentially making money equal to political speech. The core issue really was established way back with the Supreme Court's 1976 ruling in Buckley v. Valego. That decision basically said restricting how much money a rich person spends on their own political speech is unconstitutional. That really opened the door for the ultra-rich. Then, much later, in 2010, Citizens United came along and granted corporations and unions the same First Amendment rights, which, created an unlimited floodgate for dark money to just swamp election cycles.
After Citizens United specifically.
Exactly. That was the game changer. It didn't just allow big spending. It structurally enshrined the idea that the size of your wallet determines the volume of your political speech. I mean, that is a constitutional dismantling of the whole ideal of one person, one vote.
I absolutely agree the legal framework in the U.S. is uniquely hostile to democratic equality. But the practical effect of Australia's system shouldn't be underestimated. The opacity here is, it's staggering. Because of a high federal disclosure threshold, it's currently $16,900, and a failure to aggregate multiple smaller payments from the same source, nearly half, something like 45% of political party income is completely hidden. And that's perfectly legal. Systemic dark money operating in the shadows year after year.
Right, hidden legally. And that is exactly where the U.S. system achieves its explicit oligarchy. That unlimited spending creates electoral dominance. The source material actually defines this as the investment theory of party competition, where this wealthy block of investors essentially predicts and funds the winner based almost entirely on campaign expenditures. Surely electoral domination, guaranteeing who actually wins the levers of power,
Surely that trumps subtle access when it comes to political outcomes.
I see why you focus on who wins the election, but I think that misses the Australian genius for influence. They often don't care who wins because they've effectively already bought the policy outcome they want from both sides. This guaranteed policy outcome is arguably far more effective and probably cheaper than mass electoral advertising. Although, we do see interventions like Clive Palmer's demonstrating that US-style capacity when it's deemed necessary. State capture ensures that policies unfavorable to large donors are just killed off early through systemic management. Look at the highly regulated high-profit industries. Take the fossil fuel sector, for example. Companies like Woodside, Santos, Chevron, Anpex, they fund both the LNP and the ALP roughly equally. Why? Well, it's to ensure that a change of government poses absolutely no threat to their business model. And the evidence of their policy success?
No matter which party was in office. That's a pure policy guarantee.
But hang on, this constant funding of both sides, combined with the fact you mentioned that only 7% of political parties' total income in 2023-24 was actually declared, that looks remarkably similar to the American model of just exploiting loopholes to hide the source of power. If the Australian system is so subtle, why are the results so explicit, like the gas-led recovery? Your policy inertia argument is powerful, I grant you, citing the failure to pass a popular gambling ad ban despite a parliamentary inquiry recommending it. Yeah, gambling corporations like Tabcorp and Sportsbet funded both parties, and the ban stalled. But is policy inertia really worse than the proven ability of U.S. oligarchy to impose active destructive policies? The U.S. system allows billionaires and giant corporations to rig the rules so drastically that some end up paying literally 0% in taxes, forcing the middle class to absorb the economic burden. This isn't just stalling things, this is an active policy failure that structurally shifts wealth upwards.
That structural wealth shift is terrible, absolutely. But the problem in Australia, I think, is how the administrative state itself is managed to maintain secrecy. Look at the Albanese government moving to keep private the details of dozens of senior ministerial meetings, using loopholes that classify them as, quote, non-portfolio events, just to avoid freedom of information laws. That shows a dedication to secrecy that just undermines public trust entirely. The whole system seems designed to reward discretion over democracy.
And that very dedication to secrecy, doesn't that show Australia is exhibiting clear signs of converging toward the U.S. oligarchy? There's an analysis cited by the Center of Public Integrity showing a culture of secrecy that has apparently sunk to its worst point in more than a decade. If it, walks like an oligarchy and aggressively suppresses information like an oligarchy, how can you claim the problem is somehow fundamentally less damaging? Let's maybe pivot to the revolving door for a second, because that seems like the physical manifestation of state capture, and it really pushes Australia further down that slide towards oligarchy. The arms industry is a prime example here. They don't actually need to be top donors because they wield influence through, institutional infiltration. You have senior officials, former military chiefs, intelligence heads, former ministers, seamlessly transitioning into these incredibly lucrative roles with arms companies like BAE Systems, Thales, Lockheed Martin. And they carry with them privileged access, deep institutional knowledge, and crucial personal relationships with current decision makers.
That fusion of corporate and state interests is absolutely core to state capture, yes. But let's look at how the government then actively protects those corporate interests over public accountability.
Exactly my point. Consider the Thales Hawkeye case. The Australian National Audit Office, ANAO, which is supposed to be a key accountability body, found that the $1.3 billion procurement project didn't represent value for money. So what happened? The former Attorney General used a rarely invoked legal mechanism to actually suppress sections of the ANAO report itself. The government actively protected Thales's commercial interests, overruling its own independent auditor.
The damage there is not just the policy outcome itself, it's the, as you put it, institutional vandalism. What happened next to the ANAO?
Right. Its funding was cut, despite its critical role in revealing exactly these kinds of issues.
That's chilling.
It is chilling. It sends a very clear message. If you scrutinize powerful corporate interests and expose the mechanisms of capture, we will financially dismantle you. When the rulemaking machinery itself becomes the prize,
and democratic checks and balances are defunded for simply doing their jobs, that is a profound step toward oligarchy, regardless of whether you call the initial mechanism structural or subtle.
I absolutely concede that the institutional infiltration, things like the slow transformation of the Australian War Memorial into what looks like a marketing platform for military contractors, or the CSIRO working directly with the gas industry on industry-funded research, that's powerful evidence of long-term systemic management. But here is the critical distinction, I think, that separates our two systems. The problem in Australia is primarily legislative and administrative, not constitutional. Unlike the U.S. system, which seems locked by judicial fiat, where the Supreme Court essentially asserts that spending is speech, Australia's system is, well, structurally corruptible, yes, but it's not constitutionally damned. And that difference, I believe, fundamentally impacts its fixability.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the theoretical fixability makes it less insidious right now. That Center of Public Integrity analysis suggests that despite knowing the path to reform, the political culture is actively choosing the path of increasing secrecy. If the political will genuinely existed to fix it, why are we seeing the secrecy get demonstrably worse? To me, that suggests convergence is already underway, driven by a profound lack of accountability.
It certainly suggests a profound failure of political will, I agree with that. But the path for action is still technically open and it's clearly defined in the source material. We need real-time donation disclosure. We absolutely need to lower the disclosure threshold dramatically, from that $16,900 figure down to maybe $1,000, to force transparency on that huge hidden chunk, that 45% of payments. And crucially, we need a strong federal integrity commission with genuinely independent funding to ensure the accountability mechanisms like the ANAO can't be punished for doing their jobs. So that's the answer to the question. Can anything be done to fix Australian democracy? Yes, technically. But the core challenge is creating real political and economic consequences for the corporate actors and the decision-makers involved.
Legislative reform is necessary, definitely, but it's probably insufficient without the political resolve to actually enforce it and hold the policy managers properly to account.
And if that political will cannot be summoned, then Australia's subtle, legalistic pay-to-play system seems destined to harden into the kind of explicit, perhaps irreversible oligarchy that the U.S. has arguably already become. In the U.S., the investment theory of party competition isn't some academic theory anymore. It's the daily reality where elections seem decided by the volume of wealth, not the volume of voices.
So my position remains that Australia's system of state capture is highly effective because it operates systematically and legally within the shroud of opacity, using those cash for access forms, the high disclosure thresholds, ensuring key industries manage policy outcomes regardless of who wins the election. We have a severe transparency problem, a capture problem, but the potential for legislative reversal, however difficult, is still critical.
And my position is that the American system, by enshrining unlimited political spending as free speech, has already performed the surgery that structurally eroded democratic equality, accelerating the slide into explicit oligarchy. Australia must therefore immediately implement the transparency reforms available to it, like lowering that donation threshold, introducing real-time disclosure to prevent experiencing the same structural and perhaps ultimately irreversible democratic breakdown.
Ultimately, I think the material compels us to examine not just who holds influence, but how the very mechanisms of that influence are legitimized or hidden or codified in law. That really determines whether power operates through normalized, legalistic access or through outright financial domination.
Exactly. And whether that mechanism is a legislative loophole or a constitutional ruling, the result seems to be the wealthy defining the policy landscape. We're left asking, which path is quicker and maybe more certain in fundamentally undermining the principles of democratic equality?